It is the late summer of 476 AD. A teenage boy bearing the grand yet diminutive name Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, sits on the throne of what was once the most powerful empire in the world. Around him, the echoes of Rome's glorious past reverberate like a fading dream. The eternal city that once dominated continents now clings to the fragile threads of its existence. The great legions are no more, replaced by fragmented forces of mercenaries, foreign tribes, and ambitious warlords. In the shadows of Ravenna, betrayal brews. Orestes, a Roman general and father to the boy emperor, faces the simmering wrath of his own Germanic allies. Leading them is Odoacer, a man of uncertain origins but undeniable ambition, poised to seize power in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. On September 4th, the unthinkable happens. The Roman emperor is deposed, not by a rival Roman claimant, but by a barbarian king. The Western Empire, for centuries a symbol of unmatched dominance, breathes its last. But was this truly the end, or merely another chapter in a long story of transformation? Rome did not fall in a day, and its legacy would live on in unexpected ways. This is not just the story of an empire's demise. It is the beginning of something new, a moment that reshaped the course of history forever. Stay with us as we unravel the truth behind the so-called fall of Rome and uncover the intricate web of events, people, and power that changed the ancient world forever. History is created by people, so this is where we will start. There were few important persons included in the event we are speaking about today, so let's introduce them. First of the two most important protagonists was Romulus Augustulus, young teenage emperor. For now, we will point to his name, which is quite interesting. He is named after Romulus, legendary and mythologized founder of Rome from 753 BC, and after Augustus, first Roman emperor after the Roman Republic had fallen at the end of the 1st century BC. Octavian Augustus ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. Augustus means majestic, great, or venerable in Latin. The other interesting point of his name is that it is in diminutive form. Romulus Augustulus translates into Little Augustus, which is a reflection of his young age and his low profile and impact. Stay with us to learn about him more, especially about his fate after he was deposed. The second main protagonist is Odoacer. The name is spelt in different forms, like Odoacer or Odovacer. We will use the form Odoacer. He was a Germanic military leader, some kind of a warlord. His ethnicity is complex and debated, connected to different Germanic tribes like Skiri, Heruli, and possibly the Rugi. His fate might also be of your interest, so if you maybe like the Game of Thrones series, stay with us to the end to learn what Odoacer has in common with the legendary HBO series. Third important person in our story is a man called Orestes. Orestes was Romulus Augustulus's father. For now, we will uncover that he was born in the Roman province Pannonia, into a Roman aristocratic family. The most interesting fact about his early life is that he served in the court of Attila the Hun, where he became one of Attila's most trusted advisors. His positions included serving as a notarius, secretary, which involved diplomatic missions to Constantinople during the 450s. You're kindly invited to watch our video about the Huns, where we explore the life of Attila the Hun in depth, and we will talk about Orestes much more later. The fourth person important for our story today was Julius Nepos. He was Western Roman emperor just before Romulus Augustulus. He is probably the most tragic figure of all four. So, let's learn the fate of all these men, or better to say, the fate of 3 men and 1 boy. We will meet some more historical figures as we proceed, but more about that later in the video. Just before we start to explore events of 476, I need to provide you with short historical context so that we will better understand the unfollowing events. Western Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse just after 450 AD. The Hunnic invasions into Gaul in 451 and into northern Italy a year later were extremely destructive, and Western Roman Empire barely survived. Mostly because of the actions of Flavius Aetius, great Roman general who battled with the Huns in a famous battle of the Catalonian plains, where he was able to stop Hunnic invasion, although battle ended in a draw, and the other one was Pope Leo I, who persuaded Attila to not sack Rome 1 year later, after he destroyed much of northern Italy. Nonetheless, Rome was sacked 3 years later in 455, when Vandals under their king Gaiseric did it. Just for the record, we have to mention that Rome was not the capital of Western Roman Empire at that time anymore. In 402 AD, the capital was moved to Ravenna because it was much easier to defend it, as it was surrounded by marshes at that time. Anyway, the fall of Rome in 455 had a gigantic echo in Western Roman society and was a symbol of decline of what was a great empire once upon a time. We need to mention one more important figure in the politics of Western Roman Empire in the middle of the 5th century, because it will help us to understand the position of Odoacer after 476 better. His name was Ricimer. He was a significant military and political figure in the late Western Roman Empire, serving as a general or magister militium and effectively acting as an emperor-maker from 456 until his death in 472. Ricimer was another powerful military leader in the line of the likes of Flavius Stilicho and Flavius Aetius. Those powerful military leaders de facto ruled the empire and installed the emperors, who were, with few exceptions, more or less puppet rulers. It is worth mentioning that only Ricimer died from natural causes in 472 AD. Other two died by swords. Stilicho was executed by Emperor Honorius on the 22nd of August 408 AD, and Emperor Valentian III killed Flavius Aetius with his own hands on the 21st of September 451. The last Roman emperor before Romulus Augustulus was Julius Nepos, as we already mentioned. He was appointed by the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in a pretty complicated series of events. We talked about Zeno in our video about the rise of barbarian kingdoms. Link is in the description below, and you are kindly invited to watch it. Part of the story of Julius Nepos, that is of our interest, begins with Leo I, who was Eastern Roman Emperor from 457 to 474 AD. Do not mix him up with Pope Leo I, who we know from the story about Attila invasion to Italy. In 452, Emperor Leo I tried to get control over the Western Roman Empire by appointing different puppet emperors. One of them was Anthemius, who ruled in the west from 467 to 472. His successor was Anicius Olybrius, who ruled only for a few months from July 472 to November 472. Olybrius was not recognized by Leo I and was another puppet emperor appointed by Ricimer, who we mentioned earlier. Olybrius was succeeded by Glycerius, who had been proclaimed emperor by the Burgundian general Gundobad. Gundobad was a nephew of Ricimer and succeeded him after Ricimer died on 19 August 472. Glycerius ruled in 473 and 474. So the political situation in the Western Empire was extremely fragile and unstable. The empire was more or less ruled by powerful military dictators, with emperors more or less being puppet rulers. We will not go into details about those emperors or who they were for not being too long today. Julius Nepos was granted an army by Leo I in December 473 to depose Glycerius, but due to the poor weather, he was not able to set sail to Italy at once. He sailed to Italy only in the spring of 474, and during that time Leo passed away and was succeeded by Emperor Zeno, who also backed Nepos' expedition. Zeno ruled until 491, with a short break from January 474 to August 475, when he was deposed by military leader Basiliscus. Ullius Nepos landed with his army at Portus, near Rome, and swiftly deposed Glycerius, and was crowned Western Emperor in Rome on 24th of June 474. He was the last emperor to be crowned in Rome until Charlemagne, who was crowned there on Christmas Day, 800 AD. So Julius Nepos was a legitimate Western Roman emperor recognized by the Eastern Roman Emperor. Nepos was born into a prominent Dalmatian family and rose through the ranks of the Roman military and administration. He was a relative of Marcellinus, a powerful general who had controlled Dalmatia. We will not go deep into his reign and will only mention that he appointed Orestes as Magister Militum in 475, which proved to be a fatal mistake. Orestes' army, which included many foederati forces, soon turned against Julius Nepos because he did not want to grant land for Germanic warriors to settle. Orestes had taken control of Ravenna by the 28th of August, 475, and Julius Nepos fled to Salona, modern-day Split, Croatia, where he would continue to reign until his death assassination in 480. With the emperor far away, Orestes elevated his son Romulus as Augustus on 31st October 475, recognized by most historians as the last Western Roman emperor. Why Orestes waited 2 months with appointment is mystery to the historians. Probably he was waiting for Eastern Roman Empire approval, but this approval never came in. Romulus Augustulus did not possess any real power at all and was only a puppet in his father's hands, picture that we saw so many times in the history of Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. Now Odoacer came into the play. At that time, he was a subordinate of Orestes. He became head of the barbarian federati military forces of Italy. Under the command of Orestes, there were significant contingents of Germanic peoples made up mostly of Rugi and Heruli tribesmen. Tensions soon arose between Odoacer and Orestes. Federati petitioned Orestes to reward them for their services by granting them lands and settling them permanently in Italy. Orestes refused their petition, and they turned to Odoacer to lead their revolt against Orestes. Orestes was killed at Placentia, modern-day Piacenza, on 28th August 476, along with his brother Paulus. The Germanic Foederati, the Syrians, and the Heruli, as well as a large segment of the Italic Roman army, proclaimed Odoacer as a rex, or king, of Italy. Odoacer then advanced to Ravenna and captured the city, compelling the young Emperor Romulus to abdicate on 4th September. It is now time to learn the fate of the young usurper emperor. According to a contemporary source called Anonymous Valesianus, Odoacer was moved by Romulus's youth and his beauty to not only spare his life, but give him a pension of 6,000 solidi and send him to Campania to live with his relatives. There are some other reports, like that he was sent to a monastery in Ravenna, but these claims are unconfirmed. Modern historian Adrian Goldsworthy, who wrote an excellent book about the fall of the Roman Empire titled How Rome Fell, has a slightly different opinion about the fate of the young emperor. In a lecture linked in a description below, he states that Romulus Augustulus was so unimportant that he was not even worth killing him by Odoacer. Anyway, he survived those extra-tumulus times, and it was not heard a lot about him anymore. Only thing I found is that he managed to live until the times of Theodoric the Great, probably even until 507 to 511 AD. After that, nothing special happened. Following Romulus Augustus's deposition, according to the Byzantine historian Malchus, upon hearing of the accession of Zeno to the throne, the Senate in Rome sent an embassy to the Eastern Emperor and bestowed upon him the Western imperial insignia. The message was clear: the West no longer required a separate emperor, for one monarch sufficed to rule the world. In response, Zeno accepted their gifts, and this essentially brought to an end any puppet emperors in the West. With Nepos banished and Anthemius dead, Italy was another province of what was someday Western Roman Empire, to be ruled by so-called barbarian kings. In our previous videos, we saw same stories in North Africa, which was ruled by Vandals from 439. We saw the same story in Spain and Aquitania, where Visigoths established their own kingdom. Burgundians established their kingdom in Sapordia, modern-day Savoy in Western Alps. All these kingdoms was tried to be ruled in Roman fashion. So events from late summer of 476 in Italy were really not something special and new in the eyes of contemporaries. Just another emperor deposed and just another new king installed. The only thing that was different on that occasion was that Odoacer did not install a puppet ruler to reign in his name. Now it is time to uncover the fate of Odoacer, meeting his end on 15th March 493 in Ravenna, when he was killed by Theodoric the Great on a banquet to celebrate the end of war between Theodoric Ostrogoths and Odoacer. We described this conflict in detail in our videos about the Theodoric and Alaric, and in our other video about the rise of barbarian kingdoms, so we will not repeat here ourselves. It was some kind of a reprisal of the Red Wedding in the Game of Thrones series, although the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones had different historical inspiration. It was inspired by the so-called Black Dinner, which refers to an event in late medieval Scotland, in which the principal heads of the Douglas clan were invited to dine with King James II, that ultimately led to them being falsely executed in AD 1440. Anyway, Odoacer suffered the same fate on 15th March 493. He was sliced by half from Theodoric, and then his wife and child were also murdered, as a lot of his followers across northern Italy, and the stage for Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy was set. There was another famous murder committed on the 15th of March. 44 BC, in the Roman Senate life of Julius Caesar, was ended by the swords of Brutus and his colleagues. So, not a pleasant date at all. Historical context is even darker if we mention that on 15th March, Romans celebrated the so-called Ide of March, a day associated with misfortune and doom. Let's now put events from 476 into historical context and long-term historical view. A significant debate among historians revolves around whether 476 AD should be viewed as a definitive fall or as part of a longer process of transformation. The first historian that saw 476 events as the end of Western Roman Empire was Eastern Roman historian Marcellinus Commes. He wrote that when Odoacer, king of the Goths, took control of Rome, the Western Empire of the Roman people perished. But no one thought this at the time. The fall of Rome in 476 is a historical turning point that was invented nearly 50 years later as a pretext for a devastating war in which Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, tried to conquer Italy. So this first interpretation of 476 as a fall and end was inspired by deep political motivation. If you would like to dig deeper into how memory of fall of Rome was created, I suggest you to get a copy of Great Book, written by Marian Cruz, titled The Politics of Roman Memory from the Fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Age of Justinian, from 2019. The concepts of creation of memory of how Rome fell and how then that memory was used for different purposes are explained in detail in that book. Over time, interpretations have evolved. Early historians often viewed the fall as a catastrophic event, while modern scholars tend to emphasize complexity and gradual change. This shift reflects broader trends in historiography, moving from simple narratives to nuanced analyses that consider multiple factors. In the centuries following the fall of Rome, historians often viewed the event as a catastrophic collapse, as we already saw in the example of Marcellinus Comus. This perspective was influenced by the prevailing romantic notions of a glorious Roman past being irrevocably lost. The narrative emphasized chaos, barbarian invasions, and moral decay, portraying the fall as a sudden and complete breakdown of civilization. The 18th and 19th centuries saw historians like Edward Gibbon popularize the idea that Rome's fall was the result of internal weaknesses, such as political corruption and economic decline. Gibbon's work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, framed the fall as a gradual process rather than a single event, suggesting that multiple factors contributed to Rome's demise. By the mid-20th century, historians began to adopt more nuanced views. Scholars started to emphasize continuity in governance and culture after 476 AD, arguing that many Roman institutions persisted in various forms within the successor states. This shift reflected a broader trend in historiography that favored complexity over simplistic narratives. An important example of that kind of transformation is the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, where Latin was used as a formal language in political institutions until the end of kingdom, and many Roman officials took positions inside the King Gaiseric government. Many historians take the narrative in which so-called barbarian kingdoms are ruled in a Roman way. The focus expanded to include social and economic factors contributing to Rome's decline. Historians explored issues like economic instability, reliance on slave labor, and demographic changes, which provided a more comprehensive understanding of the empire's challenges. In recent decades, many historians argue that rather than viewing 476 AD as a definitive fall, it should be seen as part of a longer process of transformation. This perspective highlights the blending of Roman and barbarian cultures and the emergence of new political entities in Europe. Scholars emphasize that while political authority shifted, many aspects of Roman culture continued to influence medieval Europe. The evolution of historiography concerning Rome's fall reflects broader trends in historical scholarship. Modern historians often use interdisciplinary approaches, incorporating archaeology, anthropology, and sociology to understand this complex period better. So, to conclude, events from late summer 476 were nothing special in the history of Rome, or were not something that Roman citizens would not have witnessed in the 5th century. Ricimer, Gundobad, and other warlords deposed and installed many emperors prior to events of the 476 AD. The only difference was that when Odoacer displaced the boy emperor, he did not install a new puppet emperor to rule in his name, but proclaimed himself as a king or rex of Italy. Even this process was nothing new, as many parts of Western Roman Empire had so-called barbaric kings until then. We can mention Vandal kingdom in Numidia, Burgundian kingdom, where one of our protagonists became king, etc. Italy was just another brick in the wall of building new medieval Europe, the creation which started more than 100 years earlier when Huns invaded Germanic tribes in southeastern Europe and caused them to migrate to Balkan provinces of the Roman Empire. If you would like to know more about the Huns, who were the main catalysts of those events, you are kindly invited to watch our video about them, where their history is covered in depth.